morning, everybody. Welcome to Maine Historical Society. It's wonderful to see all of you here for a really very special moment, I think, to many of us for MHS, which is the inaugural William David Barry Memorial Lecture. What a special treat that is. My name is Steve Brummit. I'm the Executive Director of Maine Historical Society, and again, we're so happy to have everybody come in a sunny Saturday morning. It's cold, but it's sunny. I'm heading from here to take a dock out. Yeah. Anyway, what a treat we have for us here today. A chance to celebrate Bill Barry's wonderful legacy here, to hear some great history, and to express our appreciation for the generous gift that makes this new endowed lecture series possible. With this new lecture series, we honor not only the life and work of Bill Barry, but also his spirit, his deep curiosity, his humor, and his love for Maine's history and people. Bill believed that history was for everyone. He had a gift for making the past come alive and for showing how stories connect us across generations. This lecture series will carry that vision forward. I want to take a minute to place Bill within the DNA of MHS, past, present, and future. As I hope you sense, we are in the midst of a really incredible era at MHS right now. As we head into America's 250th in 2026 next year, MHS has ambitious plans and put itself into a position to play a really critical role in helping reestablish productive, respectful civic dialogue. What a great opportunity we have. I can't overstate the extent to which Bill was a linchpin in MHS's development and the spirit you see in the organization today. MHS spent much of its first, we were founded in 1822. MHS spent much of its first 150 years as an old Yankee organization, truthfully, one that built tremendous collections, important scholarship, and established a strong foundation for our work today. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So those first 150 years, the old Yankee organization, really important work and groundwork laid. But there was so much more potential than that. In the late 1960s, a group of young Turks, led of course by Earl Shuttleworth when he was a teenager, shook MHS up and opened the door to a fundamental reconsideration of what history could be and mean to the community. Bill would become really critical to that process. As a researcher and a writer, he was drawn to diverse Maine communities and stories that hadn't been told. In the 1990s, he helped MHS launch a series of ethnic history forums. He played a critical role in the development of the seminal Maine's Visible Black History, which was published in 2006. Now, these were decades before anybody used the phrase social justice in the context of history as it is often today. You know, the things we think are so critical, Bill was doing decades ahead of the game. Bill was warm, wonderful, and subversive. He had such a calm spirit and such a twinkle in his eye, but he was really up to something, and I think that's something he instilled in many of us. He was warm, wonderful, and subversive. He was a spiritual guide that helped MHS imagine what it could be, and he mentored many of us along the way, for which I know all of us are just deeply appreciative. I still picture and miss, but he's still there. There's a lot of spirits I talk to, and Bill coming in and leaning on my door frame with a story, with a clipping, something I need to know. And I think he just lit us up with this joy and sense of potential that I think so much of the organization really carries forward today. We're really incredibly grateful to John Holverson and the H.H. and J. Holverson Trust for providing the generous gift that makes this new lecture series possible. So much of our work is really dependent on the support of the community and people who care and see value in what we're doing and then help us get there. We've got smarts, we've got all kinds of resources and assets, but it takes the catalyst of money a lot of times to make these things happen. So what John has done is really remarkable. John and Bill worked together at the Portland Museum of Art in the 1970s and 80s and remained very close friends. John's investment in this lecture series ensures that Bill's legacy and spirit will continue to inspire future generations. John isn't able to be with us this morning, but we want to expend our deepest thanks to him. So let's just say it's now my pleasure to turn things over to Jamie Rice, MHS's Deputy Director, dear friend, collaborator, colleague, and also one of the driving forces here. So, Jamie.
speak about Bill, who was a friend and a mentor and a remarkable historian. Those who knew Bill knew he worked tirelessly to make history accessible, engaging, and relevant. His work at MHS really expanded our understanding of Maine's place in the American narrative, and more than that, he showed us how the details, the smallest, tiniest details, shouldn't be overlooked and matter deeply. He was a storyteller at heart and a meticulous researcher, and that meant a deep commitment to uncovering and sharing facts and helping people see their meaning. He did it with warmth, with wit, and a contagious enthusiasm for discovery. Those of us fortunate to work with Bill remember his generosity as much as his intellect. His influence not only shaped the scholarship of Maine history, but those of us who continue to carry that forward. The William David Barry Memorial Lecture is a fitting tribute. It ensures that his legacy, his curiosity, and his joy for uncovering the stories will continue to inspire new generations. Through this series, we honor the kind of historian Bill was, one who looked beyond the obvious and never lost sight of the human aspects of history. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Jamie Brummit. Dr. Brummit is an associate professor of American religions at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. She earned her PhD from Duke University, and her most recent book, Protestant Relics in Early America, was published by Oxford University Press just this year. It examines relic veneration, corpse inspection, and the art of mourning in the United States. In 2016 and 2017, Dr. Brummit was a New England Regional Fellowship recipient here at Maine Historical Society and had an opportunity to do research while Bill was at Maine Historical. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Brummit.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. It is my honor and pleasure to be giving this lecture in honor of Bill. I met Bill here when I was a researcher in 2016-2017, and Bill really helped me search through the collections. I could tell Bill, I'm looking for this kind of thing. Do you know if you have it? And he knew right away what I was talking about and would help me find it and search through the catalog and collections to find things. So I am very grateful to Bill, and I am very honored to be back here giving this talk this morning. So thank you all for being here and for having me. I'm going to share research from my new book, Protestant Relics in Early America. It was published by Oxford University Press in June 2025. I'm also going to share research from my next book project on Revolutionary War relics, which celebrates the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. In this talk, I will explain how and why early Americans, including people of early Maine, visited and collected George Washington's relics as part of their religious and political practices after his death in December 1799. I will also explain how these relic practices for Washington and other heroes of the American Revolution transformed in the late 1800s into what most people identify today as secular historical practices. To understand this talk, you will need to keep a few things in mind. First, there was no real separation between religion and politics in early America. Most early Americans were white Protestants of one denomination or another. They considered the everyday practice of religion to be a political duty. In fact, most Americans regarded Washington as the Protestant father of the American Republic. And the second big thing to keep in mind for this talk is this. In early America, Protestants were a mourning people. Mourning practices were considered material expressions of devotion to God. Protestants mourned by gathering around deathbeds in hopes of witnessing the peaceful deaths of loved ones, which they argued confirmed people's salvation and afterlives in heaven. They inspected corpses, or bodily relics, for supernatural signs of salvation. They cut locks of hair from dead bodies to keep as relics. They visited corpses buried in graveyards to weep in their presence and to experience the souls of those buried there. They also commissioned relics and collected relics, such as images of corpses, like this one on the screen, and even coffin fragments, which I will talk about later in the lecture. They collected these relics to re-experience souls of the dead in their own homes. These Protestant relic practices were considered lively, supernatural memory objects. They did not just help people remember the dead in terms of thinking thoughts about people of the past. These memory objects, relics, were considered lively objects that, when touched or viewed, brought the dead back to life in other material forms so the living could really experience their characters, virtues, presences, and souls in heaven. These were considered enlightened memory practices for the Protestant dead. In the days, weeks, and years after George Washington's death, his own Episcopalian family members and other American Protestants, including those from early Maine, mourned for him in all these ways as they remembered Washington as the Protestant hero of the American Revolution. By the time George Washington died on December 14, 1799, he had attained fame as America's greatest military hero and political leader. Washington made a name for himself as a senior officer in the French and Indian War, which led the Second Continental Congress to appoint him as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775. During the American Revolution, he led the liberation of the American colonies from British rule. After the Revolution, he presided over the drafting of the United States Constitution and served as the first president of the United States. After his presidency, Washington accepted the position of Lieutenant General of the nation's army. Most early Americans regarded Washington as the greatest military hero and political leader the world had ever seen. For most early Americans, Washington's military and political success could not be separated from his practice of Protestantism. After his 1781 victory at Yorktown, American newspapers circulated the claim that Washington was, quote, the savior of the country, end quote. This epithet elevated Washington's nature and deeds to a divine status reminiscent of Jesus. In April 1789, the Gazette of the United States invoked this epithet and described the newly elected president's visit to New York. According to the writer, Washington served the public, quote, upon a scale of eminence that heaven never before assigned to a mortal, end quote. The president was, quote, so near perfection that he stood upon the boundary line of human from divine, end quote. Some older people in the audience at the New York event, quote, hardly expected to see the illustrious president of the United States till they should meet him in heaven, end quote. Many Americans regarded Washington as an exemplary Protestant leader favored by God, whose salvation was certain. They expected to meet him in heaven, if not on earth. Others compared Washington to biblical patriarchs. In 1783, Ezra Stiles, a Congregationalist minister and president of Yale College, delivered an election sermon that compared Washington to Moses and Joshua. The comparison suggested that, like Moses, Washington freed God's people from the rule of their oppressors. Like Joshua, Washington led God's people in reconquering the promised land, the American colonies. These references to Washington's Christian nature and practices were not metaphorical. Most early Americans regarded Washington as God's Protestant emissary on earth who fulfilled God's mission for the American people by securing the independent United States as God's promised land. George Washington died in bed at Mount Vernon on Saturday night, December 14, 1799. He succumbed to a throat inflammation, surrounded by his wife, Martha Washington, personal secretary and nephew, Tobias Lear, granddaughters, 3 doctors, housekeeper Mrs. Forbes, enslaved valet Christopher Shields, and enslaved housemaids Caroline, Molly, and Charlotte. In the days after Washington's death, Tobias Lear chronicled Washington's deathbed in his diary. Lear explained how Washington was resigned to death. He described how Washington prepared for death by ensuring that Mrs. Washington had possession of his will and giving instructions for his burial at Mount Vernon in the family tomb. Lear also explained that Washington died a good death. According to Lear, Washington died, quote, without a struggle or a sigh, end quote. He also wrote that Washington's, quote, patience, fortitude, and resignation never forsook him for a moment. In all his distress, he uttered not a sigh nor a complaint, end quote. This was not a secular deathbed narrative. It was the deathbed narrative of an elite Episcopalian landowner in Virginia. Lear's deathbed narrative for Washington followed the pattern of other Episcopalian deathbed narratives. As such, it provided testimony to the living that Washington died the good death of an Episcopalian who rested in the hope of salvation, life after death, and the future resurrection. On Tuesday, Lear cut locks of Washington's hair from his corpse while it was laid out in the large room downstairs. That day, the coffin and burial shroud arrived from Alexandria. Attendants dressed Washington in the shroud and arranged his corpse in the coffin. While the corpse lay shrouded in the open coffin, Lear snipped locks of Washington's hair. He noted in his diary, quote, "The body was laid in the coffin, at which time I cut off some of the hair," end quote. This was not unusual. Many Episcopalians and other Virginia Protestants came to identify collecting relics as central to their deathbed and mourning rituals. Like other Protestants, Lear, Mrs. Washington, and other Washington family members encased hair in mourning jewelry to remember, feel, and mourn the dead Washington. The image on this slide is a mourning ring with Washington's hair that was willed by him to Eleanor Calvert Custis Stewart. The hair is hidden behind the octagonal bloodstone, which is hinged and opens to reveal Washington's hair behind glass. While Lear continued funeral preparations in late December 1799, news of Washington's good death spread. Alexandria's Times reported Washington's death. The author informed readers, quote, "Conscious of his approaching dissolution, Washington bore the excruciating agonies of a violent and painful disease with that heroic and Christian fortitude for which he was ever distinguished, and expired in the possession of that serenity of mind resulting from a consciousness of integrity and a well-spent life," end quote. According to the author, Washington died the good death of a Protestant hero. He was aware of his situation and resigned to die. This manner of death suggested that although Washington's mortal life ended, his heavenly life had just begun. In the following days, editors across the country copied these lines into their papers. Americans learned that Washington died the good death of a Christian hero. Images of Washington's deathbed, like this one, circulated throughout the country. Protestants were interested in seeing what happened on Washington's deathbed because they wanted to inspect his corpse for signs of salvation. In fact, at Washington's funeral at Mount Vernon, Protestant mourners of all denominations inspected his corpse while it was laid out on the portico. So this is the back porch of George Washington's Mount Vernon. And at his funeral, his corpse was laid out here. As the Columbian Sentinel and Massachusetts Federalist explained to readers, quote, "A multitude of mourners arrived at Mount Vernon to find Washington's great soul was gone, but his mortal part was there indeed," end quote. Those in attendance looked at the shrouded corpse in the, quote, "long and lofty portico where the hero walked in all his glory," end quote. Viewing the corpse allowed mourners to inspect Washington's face for signs of his salvation and life after death. The newspaper reported that Washington's, quote, "countenance," his face, still composed and serene, seemed to express the dignity of the spirit which lately dwelt in that lifeless form, end quote. The serene expression on his corpse, on his face, was taken as evidence that Washington received salvation after death, and his soul now lived in heaven with God. Viewing Washington's corpse connected mourners to his soul in heaven. The corpse was regarded as holy matter that had been marked by a godly soul. It worked as a supernatural bridge that connected heaven and earth. When this account was printed in newspapers, it confirmed widespread expectations that Washington was indeed America's Protestant hero who received salvation and whose soul now lived in heaven with God. Those present for the funeral said they observed this in person. A week after the funeral, Lear inspected Washington's corpse again. So a week after the funeral, Lear inspected Washington's corpse again. On December 25th, Lear called someone from Alexandria to seal the coffin. Before it was sealed, Lear wrote in his diary that he, quote, took a last look, a last farewell of that face, end quote. 11 days after Washington's death, Lear found that Washington's face, quote, still appeared unaltered, end quote. He beheld, quote, for the last time, that face which shall be seen no more here, but which I hope to meet in heaven, end quote. Lear inspected Washington's corpse one last time for confirmation of his new life in heaven and hoped they would meet there one day. Then Washington's corpse was covered with a coffin top, inscribed with the words, "Rise to judgment" and "Glory to God." Finally, the coffin was sealed, put into a case, and covered with black cloth, and the door of the tomb was closed. This is a drawing by a young person of Washington's first tomb at Mount Vernon. This was a family tomb, so there were other family members also in this tomb, and Washington was put into this family tomb. Washington's funeral, like these deathbed and corpse inspection practices, followed the patterns of other elite Episcopalian landowners in Virginia. Washington was buried on his Mount Vernon estate rather than in a churchyard. This practice was common among the wealthy in Virginia, given the distances between homes and churches. Home burials allowed families to care for graves and engage in practices at graves that maintained relationships between the living and the dead. This type of burial also showcased a person's social status. Except for those buried in Williamsburg, elite Virginia Episcopalians did not usually bury family members in church graveyards. Church burials indicated that a person had no land and belonged to a lower class. Moreover, as historian Lauren F. Winter has explained, home burials suggested that, quote, one's estate was holy ground, like a churchyard, and one wanted to be buried and resurrected with one's own kin, end quote. In the days after Washington's death, the United States Congress issued mourning resolutions that urged all Americans to mourn for Washington. In the first resolution, members of Congress called on Americans to wear black armbands for 30 days. 2 of these armbands are preserved in the Maine Historical Society collections. This armband was worn by a Miss Sarah Spring who lived in Kittery. It was made of white ribbon with scalloped edges. The image on the armband is drawn in ink and shows Washington's profile on a funerary monument with a weeping willow tree. Under the profile, an American eagle weeps for Washington. To the right, there's a group of people mourning for Washington. The young woman who wore this badge bequeathed it to her daughter, Susan Rollins. In early America, this armband was preserved as a Protestant relic of George Washington, and it was passed down through a Maine family. In 1917, the armband was given by Rollins to Alpheus Spring Packard, the secretary of Maine Historical Society. This armband is made of white silk with black gauze applied to the top and bottom. And this armband is actually in the case over here. So after the lecture, you can go view this. The weeping willow tree and tomb with the initials of GW are drawn in black ink. There is a black rosette to the right of the drawing. This armband was also preserved as a relic of George Washington and donated to the Maine Historical Society in 1885 by a citizen of Portland. In other mourning resolutions, Congress set aside December 26th as the day for Washington's national funeral to be held in Philadelphia's German Lutheran Church, the largest Protestant church in that city. They also set aside February 22nd, Washington's birthday, as another day of national mourning for for the public to engage in prayers, orations, and additional funeral services. This booklet here on the screen is titled Sacred Dirges, Hymns, and Anthems Commemorative of the Death of General George Washington. It was printed in Boston in January 1800 for one of the many funerals that took place for Washington. It was given to General Peleg Wadsworth of Portland in 1800 by Martha Washington, probably when he wrote to her asking for Washington relics, which I will talk about shortly. The booklet was eventually given to Peleg's granddaughter, Elizabeth Harrington Wadsworth, in 1871. In another mourning resolution, Congress called for Washington's corpse to be removed from Mount Vernon and reinterred under the United States Capitol, so the building itself would be infused with his virtuous presence, and all Americans could visit the site to experience the spiritual power of Washington's earthly remains. In fact, the crypt under the Capitol had been designed with this purpose in mind, although on his deathbed, Washington chose a will that favored home burial. While these mourning resolutions did not use the words religion or Protestantism, they upheld very specific white Protestant mourning practices as normative political practices for all Americans, even those who did not identify as Protestants. With the mourning armbands, Congress urged all Americans to dress in mourning garb like Protestants did for their own family members. This mourning dress visually fashioned Americans into Protestant mourners and marked them as members of one mourning Protestant family. The National Funeral Service was a Protestant service held in a Protestant church. The mourning songs for Washington were modeled on Protestant hymns for the dead. Congress's wish to reinter Washington's corpse under the Capitol so Americans could visit it and experience his heavenly presence was a Protestant mourning practice for dead Christian leaders, family members, and friends. Congress merged mourning for Washington as a Protestant devotional practice and a Republican duty for all American citizens, even those who did not identify as Protestants. Over the next year, the United States Congress debated exactly how Washington's corpse would be reburied in Washington, D.C. Some congressmen did not think burying Washington in the Capitol crypt with a small monument over the remains would do justice to his memory. Many members wanted to mark Washington's new grave with a grand monument, something that would express his eternal glory and immortality. A proposal carried that set aside $200,000 of money at that time to build an extravagant mausoleum not far from the Capitol. It was supposed to house Washington's corpse inside a special burial chamber. Americans would be able to visit Washington's corpse and experience his glory, immortality, and spiritual presence there. This image here is one designed for the mausoleum submitted by Benjamin Latrobe. You can see here on the right, it's very light, but the Potomac River is in the background, and on the left, the Capitol building is off into the distance. So this was supposed to be one of the designs for this new Washington mausoleum where his body would be reinterred in D.C. Although Congress chose a much larger design by George Dance. These are the plans that George Dance submitted for a pyramid mausoleum to George Washington. By December 1801, however, political infighting prevented Senate and House members from agreeing on a final version of the mausoleum. So in 1801, Congress still is fighting. This mausoleum was never built. Washington's corpse remained buried at Mount Vernon in the old family tomb until 1831, when the new tomb was built. While Congress debated the mausoleum plans, many American Protestants continued to mourn for Washington like they mourned their own family members. In fact, daughters of the American Republic mourned their nation's father by collecting locks of his hair. In January 1800, Eliza Wadsworth, a woman in her early 20s, wrote to her father, Peleg Wadsworth, a congressman from the District of Maine stationed in Philadelphia. So this is Eliza, and you can see this miniature portrait after the talk if you want. So Eliza was writing to her father, who was stationed in Philadelphia. Her thoughts moved from her love and veneration for God to mourning for George Washington. Eliza wrote to her father, quote, "I have wondered that you have not filled a sheet or two with the thoughts that would naturally arise on the death of General Washington," end quote. Like other Protestants, she mourned for Washington and wanted a relic. She confessed, quote, "Papa, I will tell you what I want more than anything I think of at present. It is a scrap of General Washington's handwriting, perhaps his name," end quote. On second thought, Eliza asked, quote, "Papa, had he hair? A lock of that I should value more highly still," end quote. She knew this request was probably not practical, but hoped at the very least for the handwriting. Peleg Wadsworth did not disappoint his daughter. Without her knowledge, he wrote to Mrs. Washington on March 26, 1800, and enclosed Eliza's letter. Peleg asked Mrs. Washington for, quote, "some relic of the great man whose death America and the world deplore with you," end quote. Tobias Lear fulfilled the request on Mrs. Washington's behalf. On April 5th, Lear returned Eliza's letter to her father with a lock of Washington's hair. Lear instructed her to keep it as, quote, "a memorial of veneration for his character," end quote. On April 12th, Peleg forwarded the relic to his daughter with copies of all the letters. One of these letters is also in the case here. On April 24th, Eliza explained to her father that she had given up hope of obtaining a relic of Washington until she saw the package from him with her name. Trembling with anticipation, she assumed it contained a piece of handwriting. She wrote, quote, "Now imagine my feelings when I perceived that my first wish was gratified. My heart was so filled with thankfulness to you, and when I opened the sacred paper with veneration and awe, that for a moment I could not even shed a tear," end quote. On realizing that the paper contained a lock of Washington's hair, Eliza became paralyzed with reverence. She could not shed a single tear at the first sight of the relic. The temporary paralysis soon gave way to tears of joy and admiration. Eliza expected that sense experiences with Washington's relic would transform her body. Like others who mourned for Washington with his relics, Eliza understood that this relic materialized Washington's virtues. She explained to her father, quote, "When I feel my virtue fail, I will open these papers, contemplate the character of him who personified human excellence of every kind, and attend to the lesson I receive," end quote. According to Eliza, the relic embodied Washington's virtue. As a memory object, the hair made Washington and his virtue really present. When she felt her virtue lacking, she would seek out the relic, unfold the paper that safeguarded it, and stare at the relic. Experiencing the relic through sight and touch allowed Eliza to have a sense experience with it. She expected that this experience would transform her own body. The relic was powerful and could mold her body into a virtuous body, like George Washington's body. This relic, like other Protestant relics, condensed space and time to bring the presence of the dead to the living from beyond the grave. Washington's presence transcended the past because of the ways memory objects enlivened those remembered. The relic made Washington present in his dead, corporeal, and heavenly forms. This relic really was him. Eliza also expected that other people would have similar sense experiences with the relic. In the letters, Eliza asked her father, quote, "How shall I duly honor the relic? I feel as if it was too great for me to possess," end quote. She decided that honoring the relic meant letting other people see it. Eliza told her father that she wanted, quote, "to give thousands who have never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing the lock. I am singularly happy," end quote. She planned on displaying the relic for the world to see. She thought people who had not seen Washington while he was alive would benefit from seeing his relic. The wish of displaying the lock of hair eventually came to fruition, although it was nearly 100 years later. Before her untimely death in 1802, Eliza willed the relic to her sister, Zilpah. In a letter, Eliza directed her sister, quote, "Some years hence, the relic may be thought invaluable at the museum at Bowdoin College, or if Maine is a separate state and patriotism would fully estimate its worth, I had rather it would be preserved among its treasures," end quote. Over the years, the relic passed from Zilpah to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the famed poet. Longfellow encased this relic in this golden locket in 1850. The inside left panel of the locket was engraved with these words, "Washington's hair, given by Mrs. Washington to Miss Eliza Wadsworth, April 5th, 1800, end quote. Thereafter, the relic passed to Longfellow's daughter Alice, who donated it to the Maine Historical Society in 1899. Today, Washington's relic does not work as a lively material memory of a dead Protestant. It is considered a passive object in a historical archive. While members of the public can view it, most modern Americans do not understand this relic to work as Eliza did. Artists also sold images of Washington's apotheosis, which depicted his embodied soul rising to heaven. In December 1800, 2 New York newspapers advertised prints of David Edwin's engraving Apotheosis of Washington. According to advertisements, the scene depicted Washington, quote, "rising gently in a graceful attitude on light clouds from Mount Vernon, which appears underneath," end quote. In the bottom right corner, Mount Vernon gleams in the distance. A cherub hovers over Washington's right shoulder while holding a wreath of immortality over his head. Over his left shoulder, other immortal heroes of the American Revolution, General Joseph Warren, who died in the Battle of Bunker Hill, and General Richard Montgomery, who died in the Quebec campaign, welcome Washington to heaven. So you can see these other generals depicted here in heaven. They are welcoming Washington to heaven. Other artists produced similar scenes of Washington's resurrected body rising to heaven. And this is one print that is in the Maine Historical Society collections. In December 1800, newspapers advertised John James Barrett's proof print of Washington emerging from his tomb as the apotheosis of Washington. According to an advertisement, the image showed, quote, "General Washington, raised from the tomb by the spiritual and temporal genius, assisted by immortality," end quote. Around Washington's tomb, figures of a Native American, Columbia, faith, hope, and charity mourn. Although not published until January 1802, this engraving became a popular Washington apotheosis image. And in fact, English artists produced it as a transfer print on pictures which they sold in the United States. And this picture is also in the collections of the Maine Historical Society. Scholars usually interpret these Washington apotheosis scenes as secular images. When read alongside 19th century Protestant sermons for mourning Washington and other Protestant relic practices, however, it becomes clear that these Washington apotheosis images visualized Protestant mourning practices. This image depicted Washington's embodied soul rising to immortality in heaven. It pictured what many Protestant ministers preached about Washington's soul in their funeral sermons. It visualized what newspapers reported about Washington's soul when his corpse was inspected at the funeral. This image pictured what most Protestants expected had actually happened to Washington's soul at the moment of his death. The image combined an image of Washington's embodied soul rising to heaven surrounded by mourners with the future resurrection of his Christ-like body. Like printed sermons, this image condensed the time between Washington's death, when his soul rose to immortality, and his future bodily resurrection. It was a Protestant mourning scene at a tomb and a resurrection scene. Washington apotheosis images were produced in a Protestant culture that mourned by inspecting corpses, experiencing the real presence of souls, and waiting for the resurrection. These were not secular images deployed in an American civil religion distinct from Protestantism. They were Protestant relics. Protestants looked at these images to see Washington's corpse, soul, and resurrected body. After the congressional bill for constructing Washington's mausoleum expired, American Protestants started making pilgrimages to Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon to be in the presence of his corpse and experience his heavenly soul. Some even wanted to sleep in the room where Washington died to glimpse his lingering spirit. So this is a picture of the room that Washington died in at Mount Vernon. In 1806, Josiah Quincy, a United States congressman, later mayor of Boston, and future president of Harvard University, traveled to Mount Vernon, where he stayed in the room where Washington died. Quincy told Bushrod Washington, who had inherited the estate after Mrs. Washington's death, that he hoped, quote, he might be found worthy to behold the glorified spirit of him who was so revered by his countrymen, end quote. Later, Quincy reported to his son that he did see Washington's spirit that night in the room where Washington died. Home with him. Tearing pieces of the pall, touching the coffin, and engaging Washington's heavenly soul were only a foretaste of the Protestant relic practices that developed around America's father. Throughout the 19th century, Mount Vernon became a Protestant pilgrimage site because American Protestants wanted to visit Washington's corpse, experience his heavenly soul, and gather relics from around his tomb. Some relics collected from Washington's coffin became weapons in the American Civil War. Now, the story about this relic that I'm about to tell you, we don't actually have the relic, but we have a similar one, and it's this coffin fragment. So this is a picture of a different coffin fragment, and I'm going to tell you a story about another coffin fragment that was actually used in the American Civil War. As war loomed on the horizon in 1861, some Protestants leveraged the power of Washington's relics and deployed them as supernatural weapons to preserve the Union. Just before the First Battle of Bull Run, James Curry of New Jersey wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln. The opening lines of the letter explain the reasons he wrote. Quote, I have taken the liberty of presenting you with a ring, enclosing a piece of the coffin, in which the father of his country was first laid to rest at Mount Vernon, and would respectfully beg acceptance of the same as a relic of the noble man, end quote. Curry gifted President Lincoln a fragment of the mahogany coffin in which Washington's corpse was first buried. The coffin fragment was enclosed in a ring, which Curry had commissioned especially for the fragment. The contact relic embodied Washington, the man, his corpse, his virtues, his memories, and his heavenly presence, some 60 years after his death and burial. After giving a detailed provenance of the coffin fragment and ring, Curry explained how he hoped the relic would work as a supernatural weapon in the impending war. He said, quote, "In view of the difficulties and dangers that surround you in this day of our country's trials, I would hope sincerely that the same overruling guidance and wisdom which was with our immortal Washington may be vouchsafed to you, making you the honored instrument with the blessing of a righteous God of speedily crushing out this most wicked rebellion and restoring our now distracted country to peace and prosperity," end quote. Curry expected Lincoln to wear, or at least carry, the relic of Washington as he oversaw the war. The relic, according to Curry, would bestow on Lincoln the same guidance and wisdom from God that the now immortal Washington had been gifted during his lifetime. In other words, Curry expected the coffin fragment to convey God's blessings from the dead Washington to the living Lincoln. Redeployed as a weapon, this relic would make Lincoln an instrument of God in the Civil War, as Washington had been an instrument of God in the American Revolution. The relic was supposed to cultivate an embodied supernatural sense experience with the now immortal Washington and God. Curry expected Washington's presence and favor with God to work through the relic on Lincoln's own body and help him restore the Union to peace and prosperity. To aid the relic in conveying Washington's presence and God's blessings, Curry actually included a postscript from his minister in the letter. The postscript was written by Henry Jones, a pastor of a Dutch Reformed church in New Jersey. Jones wished Lincoln, quote, "Godspeed in the noble efforts you are making to preserve to us our religion, our liberty, and our country," end quote. He assured the president that he and his cabinet were, quote, "fervently remembered before that God whose approbation and assistance can above enable you to be successful in this momentous crisis," end quote. Jones closed the postscript, quote, "May you by Washington's help be equally successful with God, who gave us that which you now have to preserve. Preserve it, and your memory shall be as fragrant to a grateful people as is Washington's," end quote. According to the pastor, Washington's heavenly spirit would aid Lincoln in the preservation of America's godly union, such that Lincoln would also be immortalized and remembered through supernatural memory objects. Americans continued collecting Washington's relics after the Civil War, but their reasons for collecting transformed. By the late 1800s, most Americans said they collected Washington's relics as historical objects that helped them think about events in his life, not religious objects that connected them to Washington's death, corpse, or soul in heaven. For example, in the 1920s, a tree called the Washington elm died and was cut down in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Americans preserved pieces of the tree as souvenirs of the American Revolution, specifically of the historical moment when Washington officially took command of the Continental Army in 1775. Maine Historical Society has 2 of these relics. One here on the slide is a cross-section of the Washington elm. A note of provenance indicates that it is a piece, quote, "from under the tree which Washington took command of the Continental Army." Tree was cut down in 1929, end quote. The other relic, which you can view in this case after the lecture, is a fragment of wood. The attached note reads, quote, "Under this tree, Washington first took command of the American Army, July 3rd, 1775, end quote. These notes of provenance are words from the tree's granite marker, which was erected in 1875 to mark the 100th anniversary of the American Revolution. These words are also attributed to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The transformations that took place in Washington relic practices can be seen in an article that was published about the death of the Washington elm. In 1925, the New York Times published an article titled, "Washington Elm Says Farewell." The article proclaimed the death of the elm tree, even though it still stood, and gave a brief outline of its history, including how Americans had engaged with it over time. And the article also offered some thoughts on how to preserve the tree. As the article explained, even before the tree died, it was considered a relic of Washington. The author noted, quote, "For years, no visitor to Cambridge has considered his tour complete until he has paused before the remnant of what was once a majestic elm and felt in imagination the spirit of the momentous event that gave the tree its national fame. Through its association with Washington, the tree came to be regarded as the living symbol of the spirit of liberty," end quote. Like many Protestant relics, the Washington elm was considered a contact relic because Washington had stood near it in 1775. Washington's physical proximity to the tree during an important moment of his life made it a relic. Unlike earlier Protestant relics, however, this relic did not connect the living to the dead Washington's corpse or his soul in heaven. The New York Times described the tree as, quote unquote, a living symbol, by which the author ironically meant it was a dead memory object. This relic did not cultivate the lively, embodied spirit of Washington. It was now just a dying tree that Washington once stood under. The newspaper was also explicit that the spirit it mentioned existed strictly in a person's imagination. The spirit that this relic conjured was an imagined memory, or a thought inside a person's head that helped them recall the historic moment in the past when Washington took command of the Continental Army. The imagined spirit was merely a thought about liberty, a recollection about the importance of the Revolution for American history. To illustrate this point, the author told how a relic had been preserved before in the 1870s of this tree. In 1872, the article noted, quote, "A large branch, 17 inches in diameter, fell to the ground. Part of the wood was used for a pulpit for a chapel in Cambridge," end quote. Although this relic was fashioned into a church pulpit, the newspaper did not describe how this relic cultivated the presence of Washington's soul or how it worked as a religious object for the congregation. In the early 1800s, however, American Protestants who did display Washington's relics in their churches made this link explicit. They said that looking at Washington's hair, pictures of him, or monuments dedicated to him generated the real presence of his virtues, his characteristics, and his soul from beyond the grave. This 1870s Washington pulpit relic, however, was considered a dead piece of wood that connected Christians to a symbolic spirit of liberty and a secular American past. Protestant relics by the 1920s and even into the 1870s were going out of fashion. Secular relics were on the way in, and they were defined as dead symbols. Secular relics were aids to immaterial memories, not objects through which the living could engage the spirits of the dead. When this article was written in the 1920s, the author also explained plans for preserving the dead tree. It noted, quote, The wood of the tree, when it is cut down, will be preserved and distributed as souvenirs to various museums, end quote. Washington elm relics were given to museums as souvenirs or memory objects to help people think about the American Revolution. The ways late 19th and early 20th century Americans severed Washington's embodied presence from his relics can be traced to the rise of a new religious movement in America. During this time, American freethinkers redefined Protestant and Catholic relics as unenlightened objects that promoted the practice of false religion. Freethinkers look back to Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense and the Age of Reason, as their hero of the American Revolution, not Washington. And they also consider Thomas Paine to be the founder of what they called the religion of secularism. Freethinkers argued that modern people should embrace Paine's common sense religion, which they hoped would finally replace superstitious religions. Significantly, freethinkers applied Enlightenment epistemologies regarding memory objects in different ways than their Protestant predecessors. In doing so, freethinkers offered new interpretations about the work of memory objects of the dead in the practice of religion. Unlike most other people of the time, freethinkers did not accept material forms of the supernatural as reasonable evidence of God's work in the world. According to freethinkers, enlightened religion should be divorced from supernatural objects. It should focus on humanity and be grounded in realizing material progress in this world, not the afterlife. In support of this enlightened religion, freethinkers set to work criticizing what they considered outdated Protestant and Catholic relic practices. And of course, this meant they criticized how people were using Washington relics. Watson Heston, a free-thinking cartoonist, visualized these critiques of Christian relic practices in The Truth Seeker, a popular free-thinking periodical published in New York. In February 1899, The Truth Seeker published this nativist and racist cartoon called Some Old Relics. In the middle vignette, Heston took aim at the superstitious relic practices of African Americans. The cartoon depicts a racist caricature of an aged black man. He is dressed in white robes and stands with outstretched arms before an altar. A broken piece of wood with a hatchet buried in it lays on the altar. The hatchet handle is inscribed GW 1738. The accompanying text reads, quote, George Washington's little hatchet and a piece of the historical cherry tree. These sacred relics work wondrous wonders. The person who kisses or touches them will stop lying forevermore, end quote. These relics, according to Heston, were, quote, especially recommended to the consideration of all miracle mongers, old bone bunco men, and clergymen in general, end quote. Heston linked popular Washington relic practices with black ministers, conjurers, and con men. Such unscrupulous and unsophisticated people, according to Heston's racist and secular logic, attributed false supernatural power to Washington relics. Now, to be very clear, the Christians who venerated Washington's relics as supernatural memory objects in the 1800s were mostly Protestants, not Catholics. Moreover, the Protestants who venerated Washington's relics were overwhelmingly white. When Protestants visited Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon and collected all kinds of relics to experience his heavenly presence as part of their application of enlightened memory practices, people in the 1800s understood what they were doing as enlightened and in fact as part of the Enlightenment. But nearly 100 years later, people thought that these were unenlightened practices. Even so, Heston derided those who venerated Washington's relics as unenlightened and anti-modern people. Ultimately, Heston blamed American Catholics and African Americans for originating and promoting superstitious relic practices that did not belong in modern American religions. The cartoon served as a warning to white liberal freethinkers that they should avoid engaging in such backward, superstitious, and uncivilized religious practices with objects. Surprisingly, this new, modern, enlightened, common sense religion had its own material culture of the dead. American freethinkers grounded their common sense religion in the relics of Thomas Paine, the Enlightenment philosopher they considered to be the founder of their religion. In 1884, leading devotees of secularism established the Thomas Paine National Historical Association in Manhattan on Paine's 147th birthday. Members of this organization vowed to guard Paine's memory, quote, against the aspersions of the enemies of free thought, to provide for keeping the monument at New Rochelle in good repair, and to collect and preserve such relics of the great writer as were still in existence, end quote. And this is a picture of a monument ceremony in New Rochelle for Thomas Paine. In 1894, hundreds of freethinkers assembled to celebrate Decoration Day, now known as Memorial Day, at the Paine Monument in New Rochelle. As Speaker Thaddeus B. Wakeman explained, Decoration Day was, quote, our great national festival of the dead, end quote. Freethinkers celebrated their dead hero of the American Revolution on this day, just like American Christians celebrated their dead heroes of the Civil War. They all gathered at monuments dedicated to the memory of the dead, decorated the monuments with flowers, gave speeches about the afterlife, and engaged relics as religious memory objects. Freethinkers' ceremonies, however, were slightly different because they did not celebrate Paine's afterlife in a supernatural heaven or engage his relics as supernatural memory objects. Freethinkers, according to Wakeman, the speaker at the celebration, gathered to elevate Paine's memory, quote, in heaven, the scientific and human heaven that is to be, end quote. They envisioned heaven as a new era in human history founded on liberty, science, and humanity. Paine's monument embodied the memory of these principles, these quote-unquote saving powers in the world, and made them present to attendees. Speakers also showcased memory objects of the dead Paine in the form of a fragment from his original gravestone and the chair in which he allegedly sat to write his revolutionary ideas. And in 1905, freethinkers gathered at the monument again and installed a fragment of Paine's brain in this monument. So this is the celebration where they were gathering to install the fragment of his brain. Freethinkers engaged Paine's relics, including the brain fragment and monument, as transformative memory objects that celebrated Paine's ideas about liberty, science, and humanity. Paine's relics were supposed to remind people of his ideas and made those ideas more interesting to the living, but they had nothing to do with his embodied soul in a celestial heaven. As freethinkers distanced themselves from supernatural objects and places, they transformed the thing living people were supposed to remember about heroes of the American Revolution. By the early 1900s, memory objects of the war heroes were not supernatural corpses marked by the Holy Spirit or their souls, but dead objects that conveyed immaterial and revolutionary ideas. Freethinkers helped shift the popular perception of relics from supernatural memory objects of the war dead who live forever in heaven to earthly memory objects of intangible ideas associated with once living, but now definitely dead heroes of the American Revolution. Whether or not they identified as freethinkers, 20th century Americans became increasingly influenced by the religion of secularism and secular relic practices. Today, it is hard for us to imagine how people in the past engaged with Washington's relics as religious objects that cultivated presence. But by investigating Protestant relics and their secular offshoots, we can gain a richer understanding of why wonderful places like the Maine Historical Society have so many locks of hair and bits of trees in their collections. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it.